say the name. You already know it. You heard it before you were old enough to understand what it meant. In a sermon, or a song, or a movie, or from a parent who said it the way adults say names that carry weight. Lucifer. Even the sound of it does something. There is menace in those syllables, a kind of ancient grandeur, a darkness that feels carved rather than constructed. It feels like a name that has always existed, one that was never invented, one that the universe simply has always contained. Think about where you have seen it. It is on album covers, pressed into black metal with inverted crosses. It is in film titles and television series. It is in the mouths of preachers who say it with a particular kind of controlled horror, the way you might name a disease to warn someone about it. It is tattooed on people. It is in the names of nightclubs and hot sauces and cocktails. It is in Dante, in Milton, in every painting of the war in heaven that has ever been commissioned. It is in Sunday school curricula handed to children who will carry it for the rest of their lives as simply the devil's name. The real name, the name the Bible gives him. Here is what you are not told. The word Lucifer is Latin. It was never a name. It was a description of the planet Venus. It appeared in a poem written about a Babylonian king. A translator working 14 centuries ago reached for the most obvious Latin word he could find for a Hebrew phrase meaning the morning star, and he was right to do it. The translation was correct. But the world that received his translation was already waiting to misread it, already primed to see a name where there was only a noun, already convinced that this passage of ancient Hebrew poetry was describing the origin of the devil rather than the death of an empire. And from that collision of a correct translation and a mistaken reading, one of the most durable myths in Western civilization was born. This is not a minor footnote. This is not an academic correction that only matters to scholars. We are talking about the foundational name of the greatest villain in Western religious imagination, the name that anchors an entire theology of cosmic evil, the name that explains where evil came from, the name that generations of Christians have used in prayers of rebuke and exorcism and spiritual warfare. And it came from a dictionary entry. It came from a Latin word for Venus that a Hebrew poet used as a metaphor for a king's pride, that a church translator rendered accurately, and that a tradition received wrong. To be precise about what is being claimed here, this is not an argument that the devil does not exist. Whether you believe in a personal adversarial spiritual force or not is its own separate question. What is being argued is narrower and more demonstrable. The name Lucifer has no legitimate connection to that figure in the original biblical texts. The theology attached to the name, the pride-based fall, the war in heaven, the light-bearer who chose darkness, is built on a misreading of a passage that was written about a human king and that was never intended to name or describe any supernatural being. The name is a phantom. The theology attached to it is a castle built on a misread poem. Here is the journey ahead. We are going to travel back to a throne room in Babylon, not a metaphorical throne room, but the actual historical seat of the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the height of its power, the empire that destroyed Jerusalem, deported the Israelites, and called its king the Lord of the four corners of the earth. We are going to meet the man that Isaiah 14 was actually written about, and we are going to read the poem the way its original audience would have read it, as a devastatingly satisfying piece of political poetry about the fall of a tyrant, not as cosmic theology about a fallen angel. Then we are going to look at the Hebrew words themselves, Helel ben Shachar, the shining one, son of the dawn, and we are going to see how beautiful and how purely astronomical they are. We are going to meet Jerome, the 4th century scholar who translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin, a man of ferocious learning and genuine care for the text, who made a routine vocabulary choice that would echo for 1600 years. We are going to walk through the church fathers who got to that passage before Jerome and whose interpretive framework was already baked into the tradition by the time the Latin Bible became the only Bible most of Western Christianity would read for a millennium. We are going to watch the medieval crystallization, Dante putting Lucifer at the frozen bottom of hell, mystery plays performing the fall of a beautiful angel for illiterate audiences across Europe, painters encoding the Lucifer narrative into images so powerful they still define how most people visualize the devil today. We are going to sit with a remarkable irony that the same phrase translated as Lucifer in Isaiah is used in the New Testament to describe Jesus. And we are going to ask what it costs, theologically and intellectually, when a tradition builds on the wrong foundation for 1500 years. The morning star is rising right now, somewhere. On the other side of the planet, or just below your horizon, Venus is doing what it has done every morning since before any human being was alive to see it, blazing in the pre-dawn sky, brighter than anything else in that darkness, appearing to reign over the heavens for a brief and brilliant hour before the sun erases it. The ancient world watched it every morning. The Hebrews wrote a poem using it as a metaphor, and somewhere between that poem and a Latin translation and a medieval painting and 1,000 years of pulpit sermons, a planet became the devil. To understand how that happened, we have to start where the text itself starts, in a throne room in Babylon, with a king so drunk on power he thought he could climb into the sky. To understand where Isaiah 14 came from, you have to stand in Babylon. Not the romantic, half-mythologized Babylon of Sunday school flannel boards, but the actual historical city, the largest urban center on Earth in the 6th century before the Common Era, a place of staggering wealth, military dominance, and ideological ambition. The walls were so vast that ancient writers struggled to describe them without sounding like they were exaggerating. The Ishtar Gate was glazed in brilliant blue tile, its dragons and lions stamped in glazed relief, a statement in architecture that said, "This is what civilization looks like, and everyone else is peripheral to it." The Babylonian Empire was not merely strong, it was the kind of strong that rewrites how the world thinks about strength. Its kings understood this. The royal inscriptions of the Neo-Babylonian period are not written in the language of the merely powerful. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who crushed Jerusalem and carried the Israelites into captivity, described himself in his own official texts as the king of the universe, the first among all princes, the one whom Marduk, the chief god, had appointed to make the 4 corners of the earth submit. This was not private bragging. It was public theology, stamped on bricks and carved into gates, and declared in the ears of every subject people who entered the city. The Babylonian king was not a man who happened to rule. He was a cosmic figure, a representative of divine order, the human axis around which the world properly turned. To resist Babylon was not merely to resist an army, it was to resist the structure of reality itself. This is the world into which Judah was dragged. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE was catastrophic in ways that were not only physical. The city was razed. The temple of YHWH, the one place where heaven and earth were understood to meet, the dwelling of the divine presence, the center of the entire religious universe of the Israelite people, was burned to the ground. The sacred vessels were carried to Babylon, The royal line was broken. The leading citizens, the priests, the craftsmen, the scribes, were marched across the desert in chains and resettled in a foreign land under the shadow of the empire's blue-tiled gates, and over all of it hung a theological question that could not be answered easily. If YHWH was truly God, if YHWH had truly chosen this people and this city and this temple, then why was Marduk winning? It is into that question that Isaiah 14 speaks. The poem does not pretend the catastrophe did not happen. It does not offer false comfort or easy explanation. What it offers instead is a declaration about the future and about the nature of power. This empire, for all its cosmic pretension, for all its inscriptions calling its king the Lord of the four corners of the earth, will fall. The brilliant, overwhelming light of Babylonian power is not permanent. It is a morning star, blazing before dawn, seemingly without equal in the darkness, and then gone the moment the real sun rises. The text itself is unambiguous about its target. Isaiah 14:4 introduces the poem with a direct instruction. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. The Hebrew word used there is mashal, a saying, a proverb, a taunting poem. The mashal was a recognized literary form with a cutting rhetorical edge. It was the kind of language you composed in your head while you were a prisoner and recited aloud when the empire finally crumbled. It was not a theological treatise. It was not a vision of the cosmic past. It was a piece of political poetry, a celebration written in advance for a fall that had not yet happened, but that the prophet declared was coming. Scholars have debated which specific Babylonian king the poem has in view. The most prominent candidate is Nebuchadnezzar II, the ruler responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportations, the king whose name carried the most weight for Israelites in exile. Others argue for his successors, or for a composite, the king of Babylon as an archetype of imperial arrogance rather than one individual, a figure representing every king who ever called himself the Lord of the universe. The debate is real, and the text does not definitively resolve it, but it resolves the more important question entirely. This poem is about a human king, a specific political power, an empire. There is no ambiguity whatsoever in the text's own framing. The body of the poem, Isaiah 14:3-23, has a dramatic arc that any reader in the ancient Near East would have recognized. The tyrant falls and descends to Sheol, the Hebrew realm of the dead. The shades of dead kings who preceded him rise from their thrones to greet him, and their greeting is laced with bitter sarcasm. You have become like us, you who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world a wilderness. You are now just another dead king in the underworld, no more significant than any of us. The earth itself rests, breaks into singing, because the oppressor is gone. The trees of Lebanon rejoice. The whole creation breathes out. This is the rhetorical genius of the poem. It uses the language of cosmic kingship that Babylon had been using about itself, and it turns that language inside out. The king had claimed to ascend above the stars, to raise his throne above the gods, to sit on the sacred mountain in the north where the divine assembly gathered. The poem puts these claims in his mouth as the boasts of a fool. I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. And then the reversal. But you have been brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder. Is this the man who shook the earth, the fall from heaven in verse 12, the verse that will eventually give the devil his name? is the hinge of that reversal. It is the moment when the pretension and the reality collide. The morning star has fallen. The one who weakened nations has been cut down. This is a metaphor for political collapse expressed through astronomical imagery. It is not a supernatural event. It is not a report on something that happened before human history. It is a taunt, brilliantly constructed, emotionally devastating, politically pointed, about a king who thought he was a god and died like a man. The people who first heard this poem knew exactly what it was. They had been deported by this man or by his empire. They had walked past the ruins of their temple. They had sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept. When a prophet told them that the morning star of Babylonian power would fall from its sky, they did not hear the biography of a supernatural being. They heard a promise about the empire that had destroyed their world. The cosmic rebellion of a fallen angel would have been completely foreign to them, an answer to a question nobody in that context was asking. But before we can understand how that foreign reading eventually took root and grew into a theology, we need to look at the actual Hebrew words. Because the poetry is extraordinarily beautiful and the imagery at its heart is purely astronomical, the verse at the center of everything is 12 words in Hebrew. A close literal rendering goes like this: How you have fallen from the sky, O Hillel ben Shashar. You have been cut down to the earth, you who weakened the nations. 12 words, and the entire mythology of Lucifer as the devil's name rests on a single one of them. Not on a sentence, not on a theological claim, not on a vision or a prophecy about supernatural rebellion. On a word that appears exactly once in the entire Hebrew Bible, that means something radiant and purely astronomical, and that a Latin translator would one day render with a common noun that the Western world would then mistake for a proper name. Start with Hillel. The root is HLLL, one of the most luminous roots in the Hebrew language. It means to shine brilliantly, to flash with light, to blaze. From this same root comes Hallel, the Hebrew word for praise, as in, to illuminate the sky with acclaim, to shine adoration upward. From it comes Hallelujah, which is Hallel combined with Yah, a short form of the divine name. Shine praise upon YHWH, blaze with worship. The root is not dark, it is not sinister. It is the root of radiance itself, of brilliant and glorious and blazing light. When the poet reaches for Hallel to describe the Babylonian king, he is reaching for a word that means the most brilliant thing imaginable, because that is how powerful Babylon looked from the outside. Untouchable, incandescent, impossible to stare at directly. This is also why the word's only appearance in the Hebrew Bible is so precise. Hallel is not a name used for any character, divine or otherwise, anywhere else in the text. It is a descriptive title, coined for this poem, applied to this king, at this moment. The uniqueness is not mysterious. It is the mark of a poet's care. The word was chosen for its exact meaning and for its ironic force. The one who blazes with light has been extinguished. The most luminous thing in the Babylonian sky has gone dark. The poet is weaponizing the king's own brightness against him, using the word for radiance as the headline for a fall. Now look at Ben Shachar. Ben means son of, and in Hebrew it functions as a relational marker, far broader than biological parentage. Ben Adam is son of man, but it means a human being, someone belonging to the category of humanity. Ben Elohim means son of God, used in various places for divine beings, for the angels, for figures who belong to the divine realm. When something is called ben something in Hebrew. It means belonging to it, characterized by it, born from it, a manifestation of it. Ben Shachar means son of the dawn, something that belongs to the first light, that is born from the moment just before sunrise, that is characteristic of the liminal sky between darkness and full day. Shachar is the Hebrew word for dawn. It is also a name that appears in ancient Canaanite religion, where Shachar was a deity, literally the god of the dawn, attested in Ugaritic texts from the 2nd millennium BCE, where divine figures with astronomical identities populated the heavenly court. The Hebrews shared a language and a cultural world with Canaanite neighbors, and the imagery of dawn as a divine or semi-divine figure was part of that shared atmosphere. When the Isaiah poet writes Son of the Dawn, he is reaching into a cosmological vocabulary his audience would have recognized instantly. And what is the most prominent object in the sky at dawn? Not the stars. They fade as the sky brightens. Not the moon, which has often set by then. The brightest, most visually arresting object in the pre-dawn sky is Venus, the morning star. A planet, though the ancients did not think of it that way. They thought of it as a particularly extraordinary star, one so bright it cast faint shadows, one that appeared in the dark hours before sunrise, and then disappeared as the sun rose. It was sometimes called the herald of the sun, the bright one that announced the day was coming. In Babylonian religion, it was associated with Ishtar. In Greek, with Phosphorus, the light bearer. In Roman, with Venus herself. Every ancient culture that ever watched the sky had a name for it and a mythology around it. The astronomical metaphor in Isaiah 14 is therefore exactly what it appears to be. The Babylonian king is like Venus. He is the brightest thing in the sky of his moment, dazzling, seemingly divine, appearing to rule the darkness with his light. But Venus is not the sun. It is a planet shining by reflected light, and the moment the actual sun rises, Venus disappears. It is not destroyed. It is simply outshone by what is greater. The king of Babylon, for all his inscriptions calling himself the Lord of the four corners of the earth, was a morning star, brilliant in the dark hours of human history, gone the moment the true light arrived. The phrase fallen from heaven does not describe a supernatural event. It describes what Venus does every morning. It rises, it blazes, and then the sun erases it from the sky. Nothing in these 12 Hebrew words names a supernatural being. Nothing in them describes a rebellion before human history. Nothing in them invokes the adversarial figure who appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. The word Satan, or more precisely, Hey Satan, the adversary, the accuser, does appear in the Hebrew scriptures, but in entirely separate books and entirely separate contexts. In Job, Satan appears as a member of the divine council with a prosecutorial function, challenging God's claim about Job's faithfulness. In Zechariah, he appears as an accuser opposing Joshua the high priest. In 1 Chronicles, he incites a census. In every case, he is a functional title for an adversarial role, not a proper name, and he appears nowhere near Isaiah 14. The two threads, the morning star poem and the adversarial figure, exist in completely different parts of the Hebrew Bible, separated by genre, context, and purpose. They share no vocabulary, no narrative, no theological claim. They are simply unconnected, and the Hebrew reader who encountered Isaiah 14 in its original context would have had no reason to connect them. What the Hebrew poem contains is a fallen king, mocked in the language of the sky he once claimed to own. It contains a poet of extraordinary skill who understood that the most devastating thing you can say about a tyrant is not merely that he is dead, but that he was always less than he appeared, that his light was borrowed, his grandeur a reflection, his divine pretensions the boasts of a morning star that mistook itself for the sun. There is no fallen angel in this poem. There is a fallen empire and a poet who knew the difference between a star and the light that makes stars visible. So who decided to read it as the story of Satan? The answer takes us to the early church and to a group of theologians who were trying to solve a very different problem. Early Christianity inherited the Hebrew Bible, but it did not inherit the interpretive world the Hebrew Bible came from. The Jewish communities who produced and preserved these texts read them inside a living tradition. They knew the historical contexts, recognized the literary forms, understood what a mashal was, and who the king of Babylon had been. When the early church received these same texts, it received them at several removes from that original world. The context had to be reconstructed, and in the reconstruction, things were added that were never there. The case of Isaiah 14 is not an exception to this pattern. It is one of the clearest examples of it. The particular pressure driving the misreading was a genuine theological problem. The New Testament had given early Christians a vivid but underdeveloped portrait of the devil. Jesus had declared to his returning disciples in Luke 10:18 that he had seen Satan fall like lightning from heaven. The book of Revelation described a war in the heavens, a dragon cast down, a figure of immense malevolence defeated and thrown to the earth. These were powerful images. They implied a history, an event, a rebellion, a fall. But the Hebrew Bible, which Christians were now reading as their own foundational scripture, offered almost nothing that explained where the adversarial figure had come from, why he was evil, or when he had fallen. The story had a dramatic middle and a long aftermath, but no beginning. This was not a trivial gap. For theologians trying to build a coherent account of the universe, why it contains evil, where that evil originated, what the relationship is between a good creator and a world shot through with suffering and malice. The absence of a fall narrative was a real problem. The answer had to be somewhere in the texts. And when early Christian readers scanned the Hebrew scriptures for a passage that described a being falling from heaven, Isaiah 14 was impossible to miss. Here was a voice crying out in anguish, cut down from the sky, brought low from a position of celestial glory. If Jesus said he saw Satan fall from heaven, and Isaiah 14 described a fall from heaven, then surely Isaiah 14 was describing at that event. The logic felt airtight. The context that would have shown it was wrong was not available to them, or rather, it was not the lens through which they were reading. Among the earliest and most influential voices to make this connection explicitly was Origen of Alexandria, writing in the first half of the 3rd century. Origen was one of the most brilliant and prolific theologians the early church produced, a man who read the Hebrew scriptures in Greek translation with extraordinary care and who built elaborate cosmological frameworks from what he found there. In his work De Principiis, which means on first principles, Origen identifies the figure addressed in Isaiah 14 as the devil himself, the greatest of created spiritual beings who fell before the foundation of the human world through a catastrophic act of pride. Isaiah 14, in Origen's reading, was not a taunt song about a Babylonian king. It was a window into cosmic prehistory, a glimpse of the event that introduced evil into the universe. Origen's wider theology was controversial. He held views about the pre-existence of souls and the eventual restoration of all things that later generations would condemn as heretical. Several of his positions were formally repudiated in the centuries that followed. But this one interpretation, the identification of Isaiah 14's fallen morning star with Satan, proved more durable than his condemned doctrines. It survived the rejection of his other ideas and passed into the mainstream of Christian thought, carrying with it the entire framework it implied, that the devil had once been a being of radiant glory, that pride had been his undoing, and that the Hebrew poem about Babylon contained the secret record of that primordial catastrophe. Tertullian, writing in Latin in North Africa in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, makes the same move. In his work Against Marcion, he draws the connection between the Isaiah passage and the devil's fall, treating it as established interpretation rather than innovation. Tertullian is worth pausing on because of the language he is working in. He writes in Latin, and for him the word Lucifer, the term the Latin Old Testament used for the morning star, was entirely ordinary vocabulary. He was not treating it as a proper name. He was pointing at a passage and saying, "This shining one, this light-bearer, this is the figure who became the adversary." The theological identification was there, but the transformation of the Latin word into a personal name had not fully completed yet. That transformation would require centuries more. The interpretive hinge that made the Isaiah identification so sticky across so many different thinkers was the cross-link with Luke 10:18. When Jesus says he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, he is describing something that happened or that he perceived in the course of his ministry and his confrontation with evil. It is not self-evidently a reference to a primordial cosmic event. In context, it may be a vivid declaration that his disciples' ministry was breaking the power of the adversary in real time. But early readers asked a prior question: where in Scripture is the fall of Satan described? The answer the tradition converged on was Isaiah 14. Shared imagery, a fall from heaven, became shared reference. The interpretive method was entirely standard for the period. Typological and intertextual reading, connecting passages by image and theme rather than by historical context, was not a shortcut or a cheat. It was how Scripture was read. But in this case, the method produced a dramatic decontextualization. A political poem about Babylon was absorbed into a cosmic narrative it had never been part of. By the time Jerome sits down in Bethlehem in the late 4th century to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Latin, all of this is already in the water. Origen's cosmic fall narrative is more than a century old. Tertullian's connection between the shining one of Isaiah and the devil is well established. The cross-link with Luke 10:18 has been repeated and elaborated by multiple writers. Jerome is not a man who read in isolation. He was one of the most deeply read scholars of his generation, fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, in active correspondence with theologians across the Mediterranean world. He knows what the tradition says about Isaiah 14. He knows the Babylonian historical context of the poem, too. He acknowledges it in his own commentary on Isaiah, engaging the human reference without fully dismissing it. But he is translating into a community that has already decided, for over a century, that this passage is about the devil. That is the environment in which Jerome picks up his pen and encounters Hillel ben Shachar. The interpretation was already formed. The image was already fixed. Jerome was about to make a translation choice that was linguistically correct and contextually harmless in isolation, but that, landing in that already charged environment, would harden into something he almost certainly never intended. The Church Fathers were not dishonest. They were not careless. They were doing exactly what serious theologians do, pressing into genuine questions, drawing connections across a complex body of texts, building a coherent account of things that the texts themselves left unresolved. They had real questions about the origin of evil and the history of the adversary, and Isaiah 14 seemed to offer real answers, but they were reading a taunt song about a dead empire as though it were a report on the architecture of heaven. And that decision, made in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, would shape what Jerome wrote and what the entire Western Church would then read for the next 1,500 years. Now we meet the man who, without intending to, gave the devil his name. His full name was Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, and he was, by almost any measure, the most formidable biblical scholar the early church produced. We know him as Jerome. He was born around 342 in what is now Croatia, educated in Rome, traveled widely across the Mediterranean and the Near East, and eventually settled in a monastery in Bethlehem, where he would spend the last 3 decades of his life in a cave-like study that he filled with books, letters, and arguments. He was contentious by temperament. His correspondence with other theologians was frequently acrimonious, and he made enemies with a dedication that matched his scholarship. But on the question of the biblical text itself, he was almost without peer in the Latin-speaking world. He read Hebrew at a level almost no other Christian scholar of his era achieved. He worked directly with Jewish teachers to sharpen his understanding of the original language. His goal, which he articulated repeatedly and passionately, was to get back to what he called the Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth, rather than relying on existing Latin translations or the Greek Septuagint that most Western Christians were using. In 382, Pope Damasus I commissioned Jerome to produce a new, authoritative Latin translation of the Scriptures. The project that resulted would become the Vulgate, from the Latin Vulgata, meaning the common or widely distributed edition, and it would become the Bible of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Jerome worked on it for decades, revising, refining, writing extensive commentaries alongside the translations to explain his choices and engage the interpretive tradition. It was one of the most consequential scholarly undertakings in Western history, and Jerome knew it. The pressure was enormous. The scrutiny was intense. He was producing the text that the church would read, hear, debate, and build theology from for generations. When Jerome reached Isaiah 14 and encountered the Hebrew phrase Hillel ben Shashar, his task as a translator was straightforward. He needed to find the Latin equivalent of a Hebrew description, meaning the shining one, the brilliant one, the blazing one, the son of the dawn. The Latin answer was immediate and obvious. The word was Lucifer. Not because it was a name, not because it had any sinister connotation, because Lucifer was simply the Latin word for what Hillel described, the light-bearer, the morning star, the planet Venus blazing in the pre-dawn sky. The Latin is built from 2 of the most basic roots in the language, lux, meaning light, and fere, meaning to carry or to bear. Lucifer means light-bearer. It was the standard Latin astronomical term for Venus as the morning star, the same word educated Romans had been using for centuries with no particular theological freight attached to it. To grasp how unremarkable this word was in Latin, consider its pedigree. Cicero, the great orator and statesman of the late Republic, uses Lucifer as a matter of course to mean the morning star. Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedist of the 1st century, catalogues it as an astronomical term alongside other planetary names. Virgil uses it in the Aeneid to mark the hour of dawn. It appears in Catullus as a descriptor of the sky before sunrise, in Ovid, in Seneca. It was not exotic vocabulary. It was not weighted with darkness or danger. It was as ordinary as saying the sun rose, as undramatic as naming the hour. Any educated Latin speaker hearing Lucifer in a line of poetry would have understood it immediately as a reference to Venus, the bright herald of morning, the light that comes before the sun. This is why the appearance of Lucifer in Jerome's Vulgate at 2 Peter 1:19 should give any careful reader pause. In that passage, the Apostle Peter writes about the reliability of the prophetic word and tells his readers to pay attention to it, as to a lamp shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. Jerome translates morning star as Lucifer, the same word in the same Bible, applied to the return and the glory of Jesus Christ. Jerome was not confused. He was not being ironic. He was using the standard Latin word for the morning star, because that is what the Greek said, and because in his vocabulary, Lucifer was a description of light and dawn and brilliance, available to be applied to anything that heralded the coming of a greater light. The word carried no demonic charge for him. It was a descriptor, and it could describe both a Babylonian king's fatal pride and the hope of Christ's return. Because the image of the morning star was versatile enough to carry both meanings, there is no credible evidence that Jerome intended to name the devil at Isaiah 14:12. He was not constructing a proper noun. In the Latin of his text, Lucifer in that verse functions as a common noun in direct address, the way English might render it as you, O light-bearer, or O shining one. The capitalization that appears in modern printings of the Vulgate and in the King James Version, the capital L that makes it look unmistakably like a name, reflects later editorial decisions made by scribes and printers who had already decided, based on the centuries of interpretive tradition before them, that it was a name. Jerome's original text made no such typographical declaration. The word sat on the page like any other Latin noun. Jerome's own commentary on Isaiah is revealing in this regard. He was not oblivious to the Babylonian context of the poem. He engaged the historical reference directly, acknowledging that the passage addressed a human king and that the taunt song genre had a specific literary function. But he also transmitted and worked within the Church Father interpretation, the Origen and Tertullian tradition that read the passage as reaching beyond its historical referent to describe something cosmic. He held both readings in tension, which is a reasonable scholarly move, without perhaps fully reckoning with how completely the theological tradition would eventually crowd out the historical one. Jerome made no mistake. He chose the right Latin word, accurately capturing the Hebrew poet's astronomical image. What he could not have fully predicted, what no one in the late 4th century could have predicted, was how that word would travel through the following millennium. The Vulgate was about to become not just the dominant Bible of the Western Church, but the only Bible most Latin Christians would ever encounter. And in that environment, Lucifer sitting alone in Isaiah 14:12, embedded in a passage already understood by tradition to be about the devil, surrounded by cosmic and celestial language, would begin its long, slow transformation from an adjective into a name. The drift from shining one to Satan's name didn't happen overnight. It happened across centuries, through sermons and paintings and poetry and fear. And the next stop is the early medieval church, where the process of crystallization began in earnest. Languages do something interesting when a word is used the same way often enough for long enough. The word stops being a description and starts being a name. The process is gradual and largely invisible to the people living through it. Nobody announces the moment a common noun has calcified into a proper one, but the result is decisive. Once a word behaves like a name, it is a name, regardless of what it originally was. The history of the word Lucifer across the medieval period is a textbook case of exactly this process, playing out across 5 centuries of sermons, manuscripts, paintings, stage performances, and popular belief, until by the end of the Middle Ages, the transformation was so complete that nobody alive could remember it happening. The first thing to understand is that Latin manuscripts did not use capital letters the way modern printed English does. The convention of capitalizing the first letter of a proper name to distinguish it from a common noun is a feature of printing culture, not ancient or medieval manuscript culture. In the manuscripts of the Vulgate, the word Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12 sat on the parchment as Latin letters among Latin letters, no larger or more visually prominent than the words around it. It was not self-evidently a name in the way it appears in a modern Bible, where the capital L announces immediately that this is a title belonging to a specific being. The capitalization in modern editions is itself an editorial judgment made by later scribes, printers, and editors who had already decided, based on the tradition they received, that it was a name. The typography reflects the theology, not the other way around. What turned the word from description into identity was the accumulation of repeated use in a fixed context. Pope Gregory I, known to history as Gregory the Great, was one of the most architecturally important figures in this process. Gregory served as pope from 590 to 604, and his influence on the shape of Western medieval Christianity is difficult to overstate. His massive commentary on the Book of Job, the Moralia in Job, ran to 35 books and was copied and studied for centuries. His pastoral writings, his homilies, and his theological synthesis gave the medieval church much of the framework within which it understood the spiritual world. And in Gregory's framework, the figure from Isaiah 14 had ceased to be a morning star metaphor for a Babylonian king. He was the devil, the greatest of the angels before his fall, the being whose pride had shattered the harmony of creation. Gregory wove together Isaiah 14, the Job passages about Satan, the Luke 10:18 fall like lightning, and the Revelation war in heaven into something approaching a coherent biography. The devil had been the supreme created being, had turned from God in a catastrophic act of pride, and now bent his ruined brilliance entirely toward the destruction of humanity. In Gregory's usage, the word Lucifer was functioning as a de facto name, a title so consistently attached to one figure that it had absorbed the functions of a proper noun. When Gregory said Lucifer, he meant one specific being, and his readers understood exactly which one. The next leap was from theology into narrative art. Dante Alighieri, writing the Commedia in the early 14th century, gave the Western imagination its most viscerally realized portrait of the fallen figure. At the absolute bottom of hell, frozen to his waist in a lake of ice, Dante's Lucifer is enormous, tall enough that Dante mistakes him at first for a windmill on the horizon, and grotesque, with 3 faces weeping from 3 mouths, each mouth chewing one of history's supreme traitors, Judas Iscariot, Brutus, and Cassius. He beats his 6 wings constantly, trying to escape, and the wind they generate is the source of the ice that imprisons him. Dante calls him by both Dis and Lucifer, using the names interchangeably, and the physical description is so precise, so imagined, so particular that it announces beyond any doubt, this is a character, not a concept. The name is a name. The being has a body. Dante was not offering an interpretation of Isaiah 14. He was writing from a tradition in which the identification had long since ceased to be a scholarly position and had become simply the shape of reality. The Commedia was one of the most widely copied and discussed texts in medieval Europe, and its influence on how educated people imagined the underworld and its inhabitants cannot be overstated. But theology and literature reached the educated. The mystery plays reached everyone else. Across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries, cycle plays, dramatic performances of biblical and theological narratives given on feast days in public squares, brought the story of Lucifer's fall to audiences who could not read Latin, who would never encounter a theological commentary, who learned their Christianity through what they saw and heard, performed in their own languages. The fall of Lucifer was a standard episode in the great English cycles, the York plays, the Chester plays, the Wakefield plays. In these performances, audiences watched a beautiful angel, brilliantly costumed, elevated, radiant, declare his superiority over God, heard the name Lucifer spoken aloud as he claimed his divine throne, and then watched him cast down in noise and fire and transformed into a howling devil. The name entered the vernacular with the emotional charge of lived theatrical experience behind it. It was not an abstract theological term. It was the name of the beautiful one who fell, spoken in English, French, and German, by actors people had watched and applauded and feared. Visual art completed the iconographic work. Medieval and Renaissance painters codified the fallen angel as a physical type that proved astonishingly durable. Beautiful in the heavenly state, monstrous after the fall, wings darkened, face distorted, the contrast between original glory and current degradation rendered visible. The imagery of the war in heaven, of rebel angels tumbling through clouds, of the great adversary imprisoned in the depths, all of it drew its narrative foundation from the medieval Lucifer tradition, and all of it reinforced the name as the name. By the time Gustave Doré produced his engraved illustrations of Dante and Milton in the 19th century, he was drawing on a visual tradition with 500 years of development behind it. His images feel definitive because the tradition he was rendering had already been refined to its essence. Milton stands at the summit of the literary elaboration. In Paradise Lost, published in 1667, he gave the Western world a Lucifer who was psychologically complete, brilliant, proud, self-deceiving, capable of something that reads disturbingly like genuine tragedy. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The line is not theology. It is characterization. It is the voice of a being who has talked himself into believing his own catastrophe was a choice. Milton was a serious biblical scholar who read Hebrew and engaged the academic arguments. He knew the debates about Isaiah 14. He used the name Lucifer anyway, because by 1667 the name was the character, and the character was one of the most resonant figures in the imaginative inheritance of the English-speaking world. There was no other name to give him. By the close of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern, the transformation was finished. A Hebrew astronomical metaphor had become a Latin word. A Latin word had become a theological designation. A theological designation had been spoken from stages, depicted in stone and paint, written into the most celebrated poetry in the Western canon, and repeated in every church in Christendom until it had the weight and the texture of something that had always been true. It felt like scripture. For most people who encountered it, it was indistinguishable from scripture. The original poem about Babylon was buried somewhere beneath all of it, patient and unchanged, still saying exactly what it had always said. But there was a complication the medieval church never fully reckoned with, and it was sitting right inside the same Bible they were reading all along. There is a passage near the very end of the Bible that the medieval tradition never quite resolved, that sits inside the same text used to build the Lucifer mythology, and that says something the mythology cannot comfortably absorb. It is the last chapter of Revelation, verse 16, and it is spoken in the first person by Jesus himself. The words are these: I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright morning star. The bright morning star. Not a star like the morning star. Not a metaphor borrowed from the morning star. The bright morning star, as a title, as a self-identification, claimed without qualification at the very close of the New Testament's final and most cosmic book. The same astronomical image that the tradition had spent centuries attaching to the devil. The same celestial body that Jerome's translation had rendered as Lucifer. Applied here, without embarrassment or qualification, to Jesus Christ. If the morning star is the devil's identity, what is Jesus claiming to be? The question is not rhetorical flourish. It is a genuine textual problem that reveals something important about how the Lucifer tradition was constructed. To see why, it helps to trace the linguistic chain across the languages the Bible traveled through. In the original Hebrew of Isaiah 14, the image is Helel ben Shachar, the shining one, son of the dawn. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the translators reached for Heosphoros, meaning dawn-bearer, a word built on eos, the Greek word for dawn. The connection to the morning star was direct and explicit. In 2 Peter 1:19, the Greek New Testament uses phosphoros, literally light-bearer, a near synonym built on the same astronomical concept, to describe what will happen in the hearts of believers when Christ returns. Until the day dawns and the morning star, the phosphoros, rises in your hearts. And in Revelation 22:16, the Greek text uses astaproinos, the morning star, as Jesus' self-designation. In Jerome's Latin Vulgate, phosphorus in 2 Peter 1:19 is translated as Lucifer, the same word he used at Isaiah 14:12. This means the word Lucifer appears in Jerome's Bible, referring to Jesus. Not incidentally, not in a distant analogy, but directly in a passage about the hope of Christ's return shining in the hearts of the faithful. Jerome was translating the Greek phosphoros, light-bearer, morning star, and he used Lucifer because that was the accurate Latin equivalent. He was not confused. He was not being paradoxical. He was using a word that, in his vocabulary, described the morning star, a word that could be applied to any figure associated with heralding light and the arrival of a greater dawn. The word carried no exclusive demonic charge for him. It was an astronomical descriptor, available for use wherever the image fit. The irony this produces is striking, if you count the appearances of the word Lucifer in Jerome's Vulgate, as it relates to identifiable beings. The word is applied to Jesus, at least as clearly as it is applied to anything we would now call the devil. The tradition that turned Lucifer into the devil's exclusive name had to paper over the fact that the same Latin Bible applied the same word to Christ. Some medieval and early modern commentators were aware of this tension and attempted to address it. The explanation that gained the most traction went roughly like this. Satan was the original morning star, the greatest and most brilliant of the angels who bore light before his fall. Christ is the true morning star, the one who genuinely fulfills the image that Satan only mimicked and then corrupted. The fallen Lucifer is the counterfeit. The Christ of Revelation 22 is the real thing. Satan had the title and forfeited it. Jesus claimed it back. This interpretation has a certain theological elegance. It is not without internal logic. Taken as a framework for understanding the relationship between false and true light, corrupted and genuine glory, it can be made to work. But to notice what it requires. It requires importing a theology of replacement and counterfeit that is not present in either Isaiah 14 or Revelation 22 as written. It requires reading the shared imagery as intentional contrast rather than coincidental parallel. It requires already believing that Lucifer is the devil's name in order to construct the argument for why it is also Christ's title, in a different, superior sense. The explanation is built on the assumption it is trying to prove. The shared imagery only becomes a problem requiring a solution if you have already decided that morning star is the devil's exclusive identity, rather than a piece of astronomical vocabulary available to Hebrew poets and Christian writers, and anyone else who wanted to describe something brilliant and heralding in the sky before sunrise. Venus made this confusion possible. It is the brightest natural object in the night sky after the sun and moon, and its behavior is extraordinary. It appears before dawn as the morning star, rising ahead of the sun and blazing in the east until daylight erases it. It appears after sunset as the evening star, the last bright light in the west as night comes on. The ancients sometimes thought these were separate objects entirely. The morning and evening apparitions were so different in their context that several cultures gave them different names before they understood they were looking at the same planet. Every civilization that watched the sky had a mythology around it. In Babylon, it was Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, whose dual appearances mirrored her dual nature. In Canaan, it was Astarte. In Greece, the morning apparition was Phosphorus, the light-bearer, and the evening apparition was Hesperus, the western star. In Rome, both resolved into Venus. Across all these cultures, the planet represented brilliance, power, the liminal moment between darkness and full day, the light that appears at the edge of things, announcing that something greater is coming. Hebrew poets used this imagery because they lived in the same sky everyone else did. When Isaiah reached for the morning star to describe the Babylonian king's doomed brilliance, he was drawing on a shared astronomical vocabulary that his audience understood immediately. When the writer of Revelation put the same image in Jesus' mouth, he was using the same vocabulary to say something different. Not the star that disappears when the sun rises, but the star that is the sun, that does not fade, that is the source rather than the herald. The Isaiah image describes borrowed light that vanishes. The Revelation image claims the light itself. The same astronomical object, the same word, two completely different theological uses, which is exactly what you would expect from a shared vocabulary being deployed by different writers for different purposes across several centuries. The morning star problem is the clearest single piece of evidence that the Lucifer as devil name narrative was never what the original texts intended. The imagery did not belong to a theological lexicon of evil. It belonged to the sky. It was applied to Babylonian kings, to the hope of Christ's return, to Christ himself. It described brightness, heralding, the dazzling light at the edge of a greater dawn. The devil was given a name that, in the very same Bible, belongs to Jesus. That is not a footnote. That is a fundamental category error, preserved in amber for over 1,000 years of tradition. And it raises a question that the tradition has found surprisingly difficult to face directly. If modern scholars know all of this, why do some Bibles still print the name? In 1611, 47 scholars working under the authority of King James I of England produced the translation of the Bible that would define the English-speaking Protestant world for the next 4 centuries. They were learned men, working from Hebrew, Greek, and Latin sources, and they brought to their task the full weight of the interpretive tradition they had inherited. When they reached Isaiah 14:12, they didn't hesitate. The verse came out as it had always come out in the Latin tradition, now rendered into the majestic cadences of early modern English. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. The name was there, capitalized, sitting in the English text as it had sat in the Latin text before it, and carrying with it every century of theology and imagery that had accumulated around it since Jerome first wrote Lucifer on his parchment in Bethlehem. The King James Version became the most culturally dominant English Bible in history. For 400 years, it was what English-speaking Christians heard read aloud in church, what they memorized in childhood, what they quoted in arguments and letters and sermons and deathbed confessions. It was the Bible of the Puritans who settled America, the Bible of the slave spirituals, the Bible of the frontier revivals, the Bible of the great denominational institutions that still shape American Christianity today. Its cadences entered the English language so deeply that people quote it without knowing they are quoting it. And in its text, at Isaiah 14:12, the name Lucifer stood, not as a Latin word in a foreign translation, not as a scholarly rendering of a Hebrew astronomical image, but as the devil's name in English, as plain and authoritative as any other proper noun in the book. Any modern translator who wants to correct this faces a problem that is not primarily linguistic. The linguistic case for correction is overwhelming. Modern biblical scholarship is essentially unanimous. The Hebrew Hillel ben Shachar is a poetic description of the morning star, not the name of a supernatural being, and the passage addresses a human Babylonian king in a literary form that every ancient Near Eastern audience would have recognized as political satire. The scholarly consensus among academic translators across confessional lines has moved clearly and decisively away from Lucifer and toward renderings like morning star, day star, or shining one. The NIV gives morning star, son of the dawn. The ESV gives day star, son of dawn. The NASB renders it star of the morning, son of the dawn. The New Living Translation reads shining star, son of the morning. The NRSV uses day star, son of dawn. None of them print Lucifer. The only major English translations that still carry the name are the KJV and the New King James Version, which is essentially a modernized revision of the 1611 text rather than an independent translation from the Hebrew. The scholarly consensus, in other words, is not ambiguous. The question is not what the Hebrew says. The question is what happens when you correct a tradition rather than a text, when the change you are making will be read not as better translation, but as challenge to authority. For significant communities within American Christianity, the King James Version is not simply a translation. It is the translation uniquely faithful, uniquely authoritative, in some formulations uniquely inspired by God in a way that other translations are not. This position, known broadly as KJV onlyism, exists on a spectrum from moderate preference to absolute conviction, but in its various forms it represents a live force in American evangelical and fundamentalist culture. For readers within that tradition, the question of what the Hebrew says is not the controlling question. The controlling question is what the KJV says, and the KJV says Lucifer. Changing it is not correcting a translation error. It is contradicting the Word of God. Even for communities that do not hold a formal KJV-only position, the cultural authority of the name is enormous. Publishers who produce Bibles for evangelical audiences are not academic presses making purely scholarly decisions. They are commercial entities serving communities with expectations, identities, and institutional histories built around particular texts. A translation committee that drops Lucifer knows it will generate controversy, complaints, and in some cases, the accusation that they are softening or obscuring the biblical witness about the devil. The institutional investment in the name extends from pew to pulpit to publishing house, and the pressure to preserve it is real even among translators who know perfectly well what the Hebrew says. Some translations have tried to navigate this tension with a compromise that reveals exactly how awkward the position is. They keep Lucifer in the main text and add a footnote acknowledging that the word means morning star or shining one. The logic is that the main text preserves the traditional reading, while the footnote provides scholarly transparency. In practice, the compromise satisfies nobody fully. The name remains in the text, lending it the continued authority of position and capitalization. The footnote quietly confesses that the name is not really a name, that it is a description of the morning star, that the traditional rendering requires explanation. But footnotes are invisible to most readers. They are not read from pulpits. They are not printed on the page people hold during worship. They do not enter sermons or Sunday school lessons or the religious imagination of the people who actually fill the pews. The footnote solution is a form of institutional honesty that almost never reaches the people who most need it. The downstream consequences are significant and compounding. When the dominant English Bible for a large portion of American Christianity uses Lucifer, everyone downstream uses Lucifer. Preachers who built their theology on the KJV preach Lucifer's fall. Curricula designed for children teach the name as Scripture. Christian books, television ministries, podcasts, and online content repeat the name in contexts that assume its biblical authority without examining it. A pastor who has preached a 5-part series on the fall of Lucifer based on Isaiah 14 is not going to retract it because the NIV renders the same verse as morning star. The sermon exists. The theology it built exists. The congregation that heard it and integrated it into their understanding of evil exists. The translation choice made by 47 scholars in 1611 continues to generate new theology in the 21st century, long after the scholarly conversation has moved on. What this landscape reveals is a tension that runs through biblical translation everywhere, but is unusually visible in the case of this one word. It is the tension between what a text says and what a community has always believed it says, between the academy and the congregation, between the precision of scholarship and the weight of tradition. It is a real tension, and it does not resolve easily. But it leaves a question standing that is worth taking seriously. If Lucifer was never the devil's name, if the theology built around that name rests on a misidentified passage, if the proof texts have been pointing at the wrong figure for 1,500 years, does any of that actually matter? Is anything real at stake in the correction? That feeling of destabilization is worth sitting with, because the answer to whether it matters is not as simple as it might seem. Names in the ancient world were not administrative conveniences. They were not the labels you put on a filing cabinet to find things quickly. They carried ontological weight, the belief that a name expressed the nature of the thing it named, that to know something's true name was to have genuine access to what that thing was, and in some traditions, to have a degree of power over it. This is why the renaming of persons at pivotal moments in the Hebrew Bible is always theologically charged and never merely ceremonial. When God renames Abram as Abraham, the change signals the transformation of a childless wanderer into the father of nations. The name encodes the destiny. When Jacob wrestles at the ford of the Jabbok and walks away as Israel, the new name carries the meaning of his struggle and his vocation inside it. Names in this world were not arbitrary sounds. They were compressed theology, concentrated identity, the thing itself expressed in language. In magical traditions across the ancient Near East, this logic extended further and became literally operational. The exorcism texts, the demon catalogues, the apotropaic rituals that have survived from Babylon and Egypt and the broader ancient world are full of the names of hostile spiritual forces, because knowing the name was the mechanism of control. You could not bind what you could not name. You could not cast out what you had no linguistic handle on. The name was the key that unlocked engagement with the entity. Without it, you were dealing with an indistinct threat. With it, you had something to address, command, and, in principle, defeat. The Christian tradition of using Lucifer as the devil's name inherits this ancient logic, though largely without acknowledging it. There is a comfort, a theological utility, in having a proper name for the enemy. A named adversary can be addressed in prayer, rebuked in spiritual warfare, spoken of with the specificity that implies the speaker knows what they are dealing with. He is not a vague malevolence or an abstract principle of disorder. He is Lucifer, and the name marks him, identifies him, makes him graspable. This is part of why the name has proved so durable even as scholarship has moved against it. It is not just that people believe it is biblical. It is that it does something a name does. It gives evil a shape, a face, a specific identity that can be engaged rather than simply endured. But the shape is false. It was imported from the wrong text, built through the wrong translation tradition, and attached to the wrong figure. And the cost of that false shape is not trivial. Consider what is actually riding on the Isaiah 14 identification. The pride-based fall narrative, the theology that the devil's defining and original sin was pride, the desire to be like the Most High, to ascend above the stars of God, comes from Isaiah 14. The line, "I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of God, I will make myself like the Most High," is the textual foundation for the entire Christian doctrine of Lucifer's fall through pride. It is the proof text that gives that doctrine its scriptural authority. But that line is spoken by a Babylonian king in a taunt song. It is the Hebrew prophet placing the king's own boasts in his mouth in order to mock them. If Isaiah 14 is about a human king, and it is beyond any serious textual doubt, then the pride-fall narrative has lost its primary biblical foundation. The doctrine may survive on other grounds, assembled from other passages, but the proof text that gave it its central authority for 1,500 years was pointing at a tyrant in Mesopotamia, not at a primordial cosmic rebel. Then there is the theology of the light-bearer. Centuries of Christian reflection on the devil have built on the etymology of the Latin word Lucifer, lux, light, fere, to bear, to construct a portrait of the adversary as a being of corrupted radiance, a once luminous spirit whose very nature was brilliance and who chose darkness, a figure whose essence is the perversion of illumination itself. He was the light-bearer who became the prince of darkness. This theology has generated an enormous amount of devotional, mystical, and systematic literature. It feels profound because the image is genuinely evocative. The idea that evil is not simply brute force, but corrupted beauty. That the most dangerous thing is not darkness, but light that has turned against its source. It is a compelling framework, but its textual foundation is a Latin word for a planet. Jerome used Lucifer because Hallel meant shining one, and Lucifer was the Latin word for the morning star. The theology of the light corrupted is built on a translator's vocabulary choice, not on a revealed description of the devil's nature. The Bible's own vocabulary for the adversarial figure tells a different story. In Hebrew, the word is Hey Satan. The Satan, always with a definite article in the oldest uses, marking it as a title rather than a name. The root means to accuse, to oppose, to act as an adversary. In the book of Job, Satan appears as a member of the divine council, a heavenly assembly, and his role there is essentially prosecutorial. He challenges God's claim that Job is genuinely righteous. He argues for a test. He is not introduced as a cosmic rebel, not described as a fallen angel, not characterized as inherently evil. He is performing a function, the accuser's function, the adversary's role, within a framework that still includes him in the divine assembly. In Zechariah, he appears again in a legal setting, standing as an accuser against Joshua the high priest. In both cases, Satan is a title describing what this figure does, not a proper name revealing what it is. In Greek, the New Testament transliterates the Hebrew as Satan and introduces diabolos, meaning slanderer, accuser, the one who throws accusations across, which gives us the English word devil. Every word the Bible uses for this figure is functional. Every word describes a role, an activity, a relational posture toward God and humanity. None of them is a proper name. The texts themselves leave a name-shaped hole, and Lucifer was pressed into it. But the hole was never meant to be filled with the name of a Roman planet. There is something worth noticing in the asymmetry this produces. The divine name in the Hebrew Bible, YHWH, was considered so sacred, so charged with the weight of divine reality, that it was not to be spoken aloud. Jewish practice developed an elaborate tradition of substitutions and circumlocutions, Adonai, Hashem, the Lord, precisely because the name was too holy for casual use. The adversary's name, by contrast, has been shouted from pulpits, stamped on album covers, and recited in exorcism prayers for centuries. And that name, which the tradition treats as having enormous spiritual significance, turns out to be a Roman astronomical term for Venus. None of this means the correction is destabilizing. A Babylonian king who fell from power is not the devil. But that does not make the devil less real within the framework of the texts that do discuss him. It means his biography has to be written from different pages. From Job, from the New Testament's portrait of the one who opposes Jesus, from Revelation's adversarial dragon, from the accumulated witness of Scripture to the reality of spiritual opposition. The texts that actually address the adversarial figure say plenty. They just do not say it through Isaiah 14. And they do not say his name is Lucifer. The correction clears away a false foundation. What can be built on the real one is more honest and arguably more interesting. And yet, for all the scholarly clarity, for all the modern translations that have quietly dropped the name, Lucifer is more culturally dominant today than at almost any point in its history. The answer to how that happened is not in the Bible at all. It is in pop culture. At some point in the centuries after Jerome, The word Lucifer completed its escape from the text that produced it and began operating as something the Bible could no longer fully contain or control. This is not an unusual fate for a name that has been in heavy cultural circulation long enough. Words acquire their own gravity over time. They accumulate associations, emotions, aesthetic qualities, and narrative histories that belong to the culture rather than to the source. By the time Western civilization arrived at the modern era, Lucifer had long since become one of those words. A figure with his own existence, his own mythology, his own emotional register, his own aesthetic, none of which required the Bible to sustain it. The name had become autonomous. It did not need Isaiah 14 anymore. It had somewhere else to live. Milton was the last major checkpoint before that escape became permanent. Paradise Lost, published in 1667, represents the final moment in which a writer of the first order engaged seriously with the biblical and theological tradition around the figure and produced something that was still, in its own way, accountable to that tradition. Milton was a formidable biblical scholar. He read Hebrew. He was familiar with the debates. He understood what he was doing when he shaped his Satan, renamed, reconstructed, psychologically elaborated, beyond anything the Church Fathers had attempted. His Satan is grandly tragic, ferociously intelligent, magnificently self-deceived. The early books of Paradise Lost gave the Western imagination a portrait of the fallen angel so vivid and so internally coherent that readers immediately sensed the problem. This character was too compelling. The argument he makes for his own rebellion, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, is not a stupid argument. It is the kind of argument a brilliant, proud, irreversibly committed being would make. William Blake concluded that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. Percy Shelley called Milton's Satan a moral being far superior to his God. The Romantic poets found in the figure exactly what they were looking for: the rebel, the creative genius, the one who refused submission to arbitrary authority, the spirit that said, "I will not serve," and meant it as a declaration of selfhood rather than a confession of wickedness. This romantic Lucifer was not primarily a religious figure. He was a political one. He was what you invoked when you wanted a symbol for resistance against tyranny, for the artist's refusal to be constrained by convention, for the human insistence on self-definition against any external force that claimed dominion. He appeared in Byron, in Shelley, later in Baudelaire and Rimbaud, and the whole tradition of the poète maudit, the cursed poet who stands outside society and burns brighter for it. He was available as a symbol because his story, as Milton had told it, was fundamentally the story of someone who chose his own identity over obedience, and that story resonated with every era that valued individual sovereignty over institutional authority. Running parallel to the Romantic literary tradition and largely separate from it was the esoteric and occult rehabilitation of the name. Helena Blavatsky, the Russian-born founder of the Theosophical Society, published a journal in the 1880s titled Lucifer. She was not being provocative for its own sake. She was deliberately reclaiming the name's etymological meaning, lux ferre, light-bearer, and redirecting it toward the theosophical concept of Lucifer as the bringer of spiritual illumination, the figure who carries divine light into the world of matter and ignorance. In her reading, the devil of Christian tradition was a slander, a demonization of a figure who actually represented knowledge and liberation. She was, in a roundabout way, closer to the Latin word's original meaning than the medieval church had been. Lucifer as the morning star, the herald of light, the one that comes before the greater dawn, The theological framework she built around it was entirely her own construction, but the etymological instinct was not entirely wrong. Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, founded in 1966, used the name differently. As a brand for rational self-interest, for the rejection of Christian moral frameworks, for the philosophical position that the human animal should embrace its own nature rather than flagellate itself in pursuit of transcendence. LaVey's Lucifer was less a supernatural figure than a symbol, a name that carried maximum transgressive charge in a Christian culture, and that therefore served as an efficient marker of opposition. In each of these esoteric and countercultural uses, the name was doing work that had nothing to do with Isaiah 14, and in some cases, the movements using it were, consciously or not, rehabilitating it back towards something closer to its original astronomical meaning, even while building entirely new mythologies around it. The 20th century industrialized the figure. Horror fiction found in Lucifer a villain whose grandeur matched the scale of ultimate evil, more satisfying than a generic devil, more specific than vague malevolence. Heavy metal music made the name a staple of its aesthetic vocabulary. The connotations of fallen majesty, of beauty turned dark, of power unbound by conventional morality, fit the genre's sensibility precisely. Lucifer as a brand for transgression required no theological content, no awareness of Jerome, no familiarity with the medieval tradition. The name carried its charge through pure cultural accumulation. Say Lucifer and something happens in the listener, some mixture of dread and fascination and grandeur, and that response is the product of 1,500 years of cultural work. The original poem about Babylon is irrelevant to it. Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, which began appearing in 1988, introduced a Lucifer for the late 20th century. Weary, disillusioned, staggeringly powerful, tired of being blamed for everything humanity chooses to do with its own free will. Gaiman's Lucifer eventually abandons hell entirely, locks it, hands the key to the protagonist, and moves to Los Angeles to run a piano bar. The image is deliberately comic in its deflation and genuinely moving in its implications. What if the devil is less the source of evil than its chief scapegoat? Mike Carey's subsequent comic series expanded this into a full mythology of its own, following Lucifer as he navigates existence outside the structures of heaven and hell, neither villain nor hero, a figure of immense moral complexity, whose choices carry weight precisely because they are genuinely his own. That version of the character, sophisticated, psychologically real, not simply evil, possessed of a kind of integrity that conventional villainy lacks, became the template for the television series Lucifer, which ran from 2016 to 2021 on Fox and then Netflix, starring Tom Ellis in the title role. 6 seasons, millions of viewers, a devoted global audience, most of whom had never encountered Isaiah 14, and for whom the devil's name is simply the name of a charming, emotionally complicated consultant who helps the Los Angeles Police Department solve homicides. The distance between Hillel ben Shachar, the Shining One, son of the dawn, the Hebrew poet's metaphor for a Babylonian king's pride, and Tom Ellis in a well-cut suit solving crimes in Los Angeles is not infinite. Every step of that journey is traceable, documentable, the product of real decisions made by real people in real historical circumstances. Jerome's Lucifer, the Church Father's identification, Gregory's synthesis, Dante's ice, Milton's eloquence, Blake's rehabilitation, Blavatsky's journal, LaVey's provocation, Gaiman's piano bar. Each step followed from the last by its own logic, each one adding to the accumulated weight of a name that began as an adjective for a planet and became one of the most recognizable figures in Western culture. The cultural life of Lucifer is a remarkable demonstration of how completely a word can escape its origins. Whether that is troubling or fascinating depends on your relationship to the question of whether names ought to stay tethered to the texts that produced them. What it does, undeniably, is raise one more question, a broader one, about how theology and culture actually work, and what it means that this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. The story of the word Lucifer is, on its surface, a story about a specific translation error, or more precisely, a specific misreading of a correct translation. But when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it, what you are really looking at is a case study in how theology actually works, how religious meaning is made and transmitted and transformed across time, and why the distance between what a text originally said and what a tradition later believes it said can grow to be enormous without anyone in the chain ever intending to deceive anyone. Start with the layers, because the layers are the thing. The original text is a Hebrew poem, written sometime in the 8th to 6th century before the Common Era, addressed to a living audience of people suffering under Babylonian imperial power. It is political theology of the most urgent kind, the kind written in exile for people who needed to believe that the empire crushing them would not crush them forever. The poem uses astronomical imagery, the figure of the morning star, as a metaphor for Babylonian arrogance and its coming collapse. That is layer 1. A specific text, a specific context, a specific meaning, transparent to anyone who knew the literary form and the historical situation. Layer 2 is the early church fathers, who read the poem without that context and with a pressing theological question of their own. Where did the devil come from? They found in the falling morning star an answer that fit their framework, and they built a reading on top of the original text that served their genuine intellectual needs. They were not fraudulent. They were theologians doing theology, connecting texts, constructing narratives, answering questions the communities of faith were actually asking. Layer 3 is Jerome's translation, a linguistically correct choice that dropped a Latin common noun into an environment already primed to read it as a proper name. Layer 4 is the medieval synthesis, in which Gregory's framework, Dante's imagination, and the mystery play's theatrical power turned that common noun into the devil's identity, pressed into stone and paint and public performance, until it had the solidity of something ancient and revealed. Layer 5 is the early modern literature, Milton most of all, which gave the figure psychological depth and made him a character rather than merely a concept. Layer 6 is popular tradition, the sermons, the Sunday school lessons, the folk belief that absorbed all of this and stopped distinguishing between the layers, presenting the accumulated product as though it were the simple, plain meaning of the Hebrew text. Layer 7 is modern pop culture, in which the name has fully escaped its biblical origins and operates on its own authority, needing no scripture to sustain it. Each layer was doing real work. Each one was making genuine meaning, answering genuine questions, building genuine community around shared understanding. But each layer also moved further from the original text, and, this is the critical point, each layer tended to make the layers beneath it invisible. The person who learns in Sunday school that Lucifer is the devil's biblical name is not being told that they are receiving the output of 15 centuries of accumulated interpretation. They are being told what the Bible says. The interpretive tradition presents itself as transparent text, and the reader has no easy way to know the difference. This pattern is not unique to Christianity, and it is not unique to the Lucifer question. It happens in every religious tradition that has a long textual history and a living interpretive community. Every tradition has its Lucifer moments, places where the language of the community has drifted measurably from the language of the founding texts, where what feels like bedrock is actually a palimpsest, layer on layer, each one valuable in its own right, and each one simultaneously obscuring the one beneath it. The drift is not usually the result of dishonesty. It is the result of texts being received, translated, argued over, preached from, painted, performed, and handed down across vast distances of time and culture by real human communities with real questions and real needs. Meaning-making is not a passive process. Communities do not simply receive texts. They inhabit them, and habitation changes things. Translation is one of the places where this is most visible, because translation is where the collision between linguistic precision and interpretive tradition is most direct. Jerome's Lucifer was the right translation of Hellel. By every standard of lexicography, the choice was correct. And it still generated 1,000 years of misunderstanding, not because Jerome was wrong, but because the word he chose, accurate in isolation, landed in an environment that heard it differently than he meant it. The interpretive tradition was already there before the translation arrived, and it shaped how the translation was received. The word did not determine the meaning. The community into which the word fell determined the meaning, and then the word was used to confirm what the community already believed. This same dynamic appears throughout the history of biblical translation. The Hebrew word Alma in Isaiah 7:14 means young woman, a woman of marriageable age with no necessary implication of virginity. The Greek Septuagint translated it as Parthenos, which more specifically means virgin. The Matthew's Gospel citation of that verse in its Greek form, applied to the birth of Jesus, inherited the Septuagint's rendering. The theology of the virgin birth acquired a prophetic proof text that was built, partly, on a translation choice. The Greek word metanoia, which Jesus and the New Testament writers used for what is usually translated as repentance, has a root meaning of changed mind, transformed perception, a turning of one's whole orientation. Its rendering in Latin as poenitentia, penitence, doing penance, shifted the emphasis from inner transformation toward outward performance of contrition, with enormous consequences for the development of sacramental theology. The Hebrew Sheol, the realm of the dead, a place of shadowy existence that was neutral in the oldest texts, was assimilated to the Greek Hades, and eventually to a populated, punishing underworld by a process of translation and interpretive overlay that nobody fully planned. In each case, a translator's choice encountering the right interpretive community became theology that then shaped how subsequent generations read the text. What biblical scholarship does, what it has been doing for several centuries, with increasing rigor and honesty, is make the layers visible again. Not to destroy what the layers contain, not to demolish the traditions that grew from them, but to give those traditions a more honest account of their own origins. Knowing that Lucifer was a Latin word for Venus does not make the theological concept of a spiritual adversary disappear. It just relocates that concept to its actual textual addresses. Job, Zechariah, the New Testament's portrait of the one who opposes Jesus, and frees Isaiah 14 to say what it always said, which is something more politically urgent and more historically precise than cosmic backstory. For communities of faith, this kind of correction is not a threat. It is a gift. It means the Bible is doing more than they thought, touching more of human experience, speaking more directly to the reality of power and suffering and justice than the devil-named tradition allowed them to see. Fear of correction implies that a tradition cannot survive contact with the truth about itself, but the traditions that have lasted for millennia have generally demonstrated the opposite. They are robust precisely because they have been willing, generation after generation, to absorb scholarship, engage criticism, and revise where revision is honest and necessary. The Lucifer story is not a scandal to be suppressed. It is a case study in how human communities make meaning across vast distances of time and language, and a reminder that what feels like the ancient bedrock of faith is often, on closer inspection, a series of choices made by real people in real historical moments, each one doing their best, each one passing something forward that was already changed by the time it reached their hands. Which brings us to the end of the chain, and to the one question worth sitting with after all of this. Go outside before sunrise on a clear morning and look east. If you time it right, in the hour before the sky begins to pale, while the stars are still fully present and the darkness still holds, you will see it. A light that is not quite like the other lights, brighter than anything else in that sky by a significant margin, steady where the stars seem to flicker, blazing with a quality that makes it look less like a distant point of light and more like something close and purposeful. It does not move the way satellites move or aircraft move. It simply burns, there in the east, above the horizon, brilliant and unwavering, and if you did not know what you were looking at, you might easily believe it was something divine. Every culture that ever existed watched this light. The Babylonians watched it and named it for Ishtar, their goddess of love and war, because something that blazed with such intensity before the rising of the sun seemed to them to carry the temperament of a deity. The Greeks watched it and called it Phosphorus, the light-bearer, in its morning appearance, and Hesperus in the evening, and eventually understood these were the same object seen at different hours. The Romans called it Venus. The Canaanites associated it with their goddess Astarte. The ancient Hebrews watched it too, every morning, from the hills of Judah and from the plains of exile in Babylon. And when a poet among them needed an image for something that appeared impossibly brilliant, and then disappeared, outshone, erased, swallowed by the greater light of the sun, they pointed at that light and said, That is what the king of Babylon is. He is the morning star. Hillel ben Shashar, the shining one, son of the dawn. This is the image at the heart of Isaiah 14. Not a name, not a supernatural biography. An image, one of the most precise and beautiful images in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, built from a planet that every person in the ancient world watched every morning and understood immediately. The poem that contains it is a taunt song, a mashal, a piece of political poetry written for people who had been deported from their homeland, who had walked in chains past the ruins of their temple, who had sat beside foreign rivers and wept, and who needed to hear that the empire that had done this to them was not permanent. The poem tells them that Babylon will fall. It tells them the earth will sing when it does. It tells them that even the shades of dead kings in the underworld will rise and greet the tyrant with bitter sarcasm when he arrives. So, it says, you have become like us. Is this the man who shook the earth? And then, at the poem's emotional hinge, the morning star. How you have fallen from the sky, O Hillel ben Shashar, the brilliant one, the one who blazed in the darkness like a planet mistaking itself for a sun, cut down to the earth, the king who inscribed his own invincibility on bricks and gates and proclamations, who called himself the Lord of the four corners of the world, who burned the house of God and scattered its people. He was always just the morning star. Brilliant, yes. Unmistakable in the darkness, yes. but not the sun. Never the sun. A reflector, not a source. And the moment the actual light arrived, he vanished. That is the poem's meaning. That is what the original audience heard and felt and carried with them. Not a cosmological report about a primordial rebellion, but a declaration about justice, about the absolute limit of all earthly power, about the certainty that no empire which crushes the weak will endure. It is a poem that speaks directly to the suffering of real people under real imperial violence, and it offers them something the devil-named tradition cannot offer. Not a supernatural villain to explain evil in the abstract, but a clear-eyed account of the pattern by which worldly power always destroys itself by mistaking its own reflected brilliance for divinity. When the Church Fathers lifted this image out of its Babylonian context and pressed it into service as the biography of a fallen angel, they did not simply make a textual error. They robbed the poem of its original force. Isaiah 14 became evidence in a cosmic drama, interesting as theology, perhaps, but no longer dangerous as political speech. The people it was written for, the exiled and the oppressed, lost their poem. What they got instead was a backstory for the devil, a narrative about something that happened before human history in the courts of heaven, disconnected from the burning of temples and the chaining of captives and the brutal physics of imperial domination. The cosmic rebellion of Lucifer is not a useless idea, but it is a much safer idea than what Isaiah 14 actually says, and the trade was not an even one. The warning the poem carries is not about a supernatural adversary. It is about a human pattern, relentlessly historical, relentlessly recurring. The morning star logic. The conviction held by every empire that its brilliance is permanent, that its power is of a different order than the powers that came before it and fell, that it will ascend above the stars of God and will not be brought down. Babylon held this conviction. Rome held it. Every imperial project in the 2.5 millennia since Isaiah wrote this poem has held some version of it, stamped it on coins and carved it in stone and broadcast it in whatever medium the era provided. And every one of them has been wrong. Every one of them has been, in the end, the morning star, blazing magnificently in the dark hours, and then outshone, and then gone. That is the Lucifer we actually need. Not a supernatural being with a Latin name, not a fallen angel whose pride Scripture records, but the pattern itself, the brilliant, borrowed light of worldly power that mistakes reflection for divinity, that declares its own permanence in the face of its own finitude, that rises in the darkness and disappears the moment the real sun clears the horizon. The poem was written to name that pattern, to expose it, to say to the exiled and the devastated, what crushed you was never what it claimed to be. When the name became the devil's property, the pattern lost its name. It became easier to preach about Lucifer, the fallen angel, than to point at Babylon, the operating empire. Easier to identify the supernatural adversary than the political one. Easier to locate evil in a cosmic prehistory than in the decisions of the powerful in the present tense. This is not a conspiracy. It is a drift, slow and unmeasured, the product of many good faith decisions across many centuries. But the drift has consequences that the original poem, read honestly, does not permit. Jerome translated Hillel correctly. The word was Lucifer. The Latin was right. The translation was accurate. What happened next? The namification, the devil's biography, the 15 centuries of theology and art and literature, and pulpit sermons and Netflix series built on that single Latin noun, was not his fault and not his intention. He reached for the obvious word and found it. and the world that received it was already waiting to misread it in a direction he didn't plan. The morning star has no name in the Bible. It has a description: brilliant, fleeting, and always outshone by what comes after it. That was true of the king of Babylon. It has been true of every power that ever confused its own brightness with the light that makes brightness possible. And if you go outside before sunrise on a clear morning and look east, you can see it still, that extraordinary, nameless light, doing exactly what it has always done, exactly what the Hebrew poet said it would do, appearing in the darkness, blazing without apology, and then, as the horizon begins to lighten in the east, fading, slowly at first, then all at once, not destroyed, not fallen in any supernatural sense, simply outshone by what was always going to come after it. The real light rises. It always has. The poem